For the first time in 750 years, an English king was asking an African leader for help, but Ibrahim Traoré's response to King Charles would accelerate the collapse of the Commonwealth. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the bulletproof windows of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III reviewed the most sensitive briefing of his reign. The red leather folder before him marked Commonwealth Crisis Eyes Only contained intelligence reports that painted a picture of accelerating imperial decline that would have horrified his predecessors. Across Africa, the Commonwealth was hemorrhaging members at an unprecedented rate. The Traoré effect, as intelligence analysts had termed it, was spreading like wildfire across former British colonies. Countries that had maintained ceremonial ties to the crown for decades were now questioning the fundamental premises of Commonwealth membership. The King's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, entered the opulent study with obvious reluctance. At 58, Alderton had served the royal household through some of its most challenging periods, but the intelligence he was about to deliver represented an existential threat to the monarchy's international relevance. "Your Majesty," Alderton began, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of diplomatic protocol, "I'm afraid the situation in Africa has deteriorated beyond our most pessimistic projections." King Charles looked up from the briefing, his weathered face reflecting the strain of recent months. At 75, he had finally achieved his lifelong ambition to wear the crown, only to discover that the empire it once represented was crumbling beneath his feet. "How bad is it, Clive?" the king asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Alderton spread a series of maps and photographs across the king's desk. "Nigeria has announced its intention to withdraw from the Commonwealth within 6 months. South Africa is conducting a referendum on republican status. Ghana's parliament has passed a motion declaring the monarchy incompatible with African dignity. Even Jamaica is seriously considering removing Your Majesty as head of state." The king absorbed this litany of losses with visible effort. Each departing nation represented not just a diplomatic setback, but a personal rejection of the institution he embodied. "And all of this traces back to this young man in Burkina Faso?" Charles asked, picking up a photograph of Ibrahim Traoré addressing a packed stadium in Ouagadougou. "I'm afraid so, Your Majesty." President Traoré's articulation of what he calls dignified independence has provided a framework for Commonwealth nations to critique their relationship with Britain without appearing to reject modernity or international cooperation. Alderton pointed to a transcript of one of Traoré's recent speeches. "He's particularly effective because he doesn't attack Britain directly. Instead, he questions why independent nations should maintain symbolic subordination to any foreign power, regardless of historical ties." The king read portions of the transcript with growing alarm. Traoré's arguments were intellectually sophisticated and morally compelling, making them difficult to counter without appearing defensive or nostalgic for colonialism. "The Commonwealth Games in Birmingham were supposed to showcase our continued relevance," the king mused. "Instead, they became a forum for African leaders to question why they should participate in celebrations of British soft power." Indeed, Your Majesty, President Traoré's absence from the Games was noted across Africa, and several other leaders followed his example by sending junior ministers rather than attending personally. The king stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the grey London sky. The Commonwealth had been presented to him throughout his education as the monarchy's great post-colonial achievement, a voluntary association of nations united by shared values and historical ties. Now it appeared to be little more than a nostalgic fiction that younger African leaders were increasingly unwilling to maintain. "What options do we have?" Charles asked, though he suspected the traditional tools of British influence were no longer adequate to address this challenge. "The Foreign Office has prepared several proposals," Alderton replied, opening another folder. "Increased development aid, expanded educational exchange programs, enhanced trade agreements, but preliminary soundings suggest that African leaders view these offerings as insufficient to address their fundamental concerns about symbolic subordination." The king reviewed the Foreign Office proposals with growing skepticism. They read like updated versions of strategies that had been tried and failed for decades, offering material benefits in exchange for continued deference to British leadership. "These approaches assume that African objections to Commonwealth membership are practical rather than philosophical," Charles observed. "But this young man Traoré seems to be making an argument about dignity rather than development." "Precisely, Your Majesty, which is why some of your advisors believe that only direct engagement at the highest level might be effective." The king raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting I meet with President Traoré personally? It's unprecedented, Your Majesty, but these are unprecedented unprecedented circumstances. If the Commonwealth continues its current trajectory, it will be reduced to a handful of Caribbean islands and Pacific territories within 5 years. The proposal was indeed extraordinary. British monarchs did not typically seek audiences with leaders of small African nations, particularly those who had come to power through military coups. But the alternative, watching the Commonwealth disintegrate while maintaining diplomatic protocols, seemed equally unappealing. "Arrange the meeting," the king said finally, "but it must be completely private. No press, no ceremony, no official record. If this fails, I don't want it to become a public humiliation." 3 weeks later, Ibrahim Traoré's unmarked aircraft touched down at a private airfield outside London. The Burkinabe president had agreed to the meeting with obvious reluctance, making it clear through diplomatic channels that he was extending a courtesy rather than seeking British assistance or recognition. As Traoré's modest convoy approached Buckingham Palace through a rear entrance, he reflected on the historical irony of the moment. His great-grandfather had been forced to bow before British colonial administrators. Now a British king was requesting an audience with him. The meeting was arranged in the king's private study rather than any formal reception room, emphasizing the personal nature of the conversation. When Traoré was escorted into the book-lined chamber, he found King Charles waiting behind his desk, dressed in a simple business suit rather than any ceremonial regalia. "President Traoré," the king said, rising to greet his guest, "thank you for accepting my invitation. I know your time is valuable, and I appreciate your willingness to engage in this conversation." "Your Majesty," Traoré replied with respectful formality, "I must admit, I'm curious about the purpose of this meeting. It's unusual for British royalty to seek private audiences with African heads of state." They settled into leather armchairs positioned beside a fireplace, the informal arrangement designed to encourage open dialogue. The king gestured to a tea service that had been prepared, though both men seemed more focused on the conversation than refreshments. "President Traoré, I want to be completely direct with you," the king began. "The Commonwealth is facing an existential crisis, and your influence appears to be a significant factor in that crisis. I'm hoping we can find common ground that allows us to address African concerns while preserving an institution that has served both our peoples well." Traoré leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful but guarded. "Your Majesty, I appreciate your directness, but I think we may have different understandings of how well the Commonwealth has served African peoples. Please explain your perspective." "With respect, Your Majesty, the Commonwealth has primarily served as a mechanism for maintaining British influence in former colonies after formal independence. African members provide legitimacy for British global leadership while receiving symbolic benefits that don't address fundamental inequalities." The king absorbed this critique with visible discomfort. "Surely you acknowledge the practical benefits of Commonwealth membership, trade preferences, educational opportunities, diplomatic support." "I acknowledge those benefits," Traoré replied, "but I question whether they justify maintaining symbolic subordination to a foreign monarch. Why should independent African nations participate in ceremonies celebrating the British crown? Why should our citizens sing God Save the King at Commonwealth events?" The directness of these questions caught the king off guard. He had expected to discuss practical reforms or enhance cooperation, not fundamental challenges to the monarchy's international role. "The monarchy serves as a unifying symbol," Charles offered. "It provides continuity and stability that transcends political changes in member nations. Your Majesty, with respect, the monarchy is a symbol of British history and British values. It may provide continuity for Britain, but for Africa, it represents the continuity of colonial subordination." The king was quiet for several minutes, processing this response. Throughout his life, he had been told that the Commonwealth represented successful decolonization, a voluntary transformation of empire into partnership. But Traoré's perspective suggested that many Africans saw it as empire by other means. "What would it take," the king asked carefully, "for African nations to remain engaged with Britain while addressing these concerns about symbolism and dignity?" Traoré's response was immediate and comprehensive. "Genuine equality, Your Majesty. If Britain wants continued partnership with Africa, it must be partnership between equals, not between a patron and grateful client. That would mean eliminating all forms of ceremonial deference to the British crown. African heads of state would not bow, kneel, or demonstrate symbolic subordination to British authority. Commonwealth ceremonies would celebrate shared values rather than British leadership." The king nodded, though he was clearly struggling with the implications. "And practically, Britain would need to address historical injustices through reparations or substantial development transfers that aren't conditional on continued Commonwealth Commonwealth membership. Most importantly, Britain would need to accept that successful African development might eventually challenge British economic and political interests. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with the king offering various modifications to current Commonwealth structures, enhanced African representation in Commonwealth institutions, reduced ceremonial requirements, expanded development aid. Each proposal was politely acknowledged but fundamentally inadequate to address Traoré's core concerns. President Traoré, the king said, as the meeting neared its conclusion, "What you're describing sounds less like Commonwealth reform and more like Commonwealth dissolution. Your Majesty, if the Commonwealth can only survive by maintaining African subordination, then perhaps it should dissolve. The question is whether Britain can imagine a relationship with Africa based on genuine equality rather than nostalgic hierarchy." As they stood to conclude the meeting, the king made one final attempt. "President Traoré, surely you understand that completely dismantling the Commonwealth would eliminate many beneficial programs and relationships that have developed over decades." "Your Majesty," Traoré replied, extending his hand for a farewell handshake, "beneficial programs and relationships don't require African nations to maintain symbolic subordination to British authority. If the Commonwealth cannot survive without that subordination, then it was never truly beneficial to Africa." The king escorted Traoré to the private exit, both men maintaining diplomatic courtesy despite the fundamental disagreement that had emerged during their conversation. As the Burkinabe president's convoy disappeared into London traffic, King Charles returned to his study with a heavy heart. The meeting had confirmed his worst fears. The Commonwealth's African members were not seeking reforms that would allow continued British leadership. They were questioning the legitimacy of British leadership itself. Traoré's articulated rejection of symbolic subordination provided a framework that other African leaders could adopt without appearing to reject international cooperation or modernity. Within hours of Traoré's departure, the king convened an emergency meeting with his most senior advisors. The Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, and Commonwealth Secretary joined the king's private team in the palace's secure briefing room. "Gentlemen," the king began, "I've just concluded the most difficult conversation of my reign. President Traoré's position is clear. Africa will no longer accept any form of symbolic subordination to the British Crown, regardless of practical benefits." Foreign Secretary James cleverly leaned forward. "Your Majesty, surely this is a negotiating position. All diplomatic relationships involve compromise." "I don't believe President Traoré was negotiating," the king replied. "He was explaining why the fundamental premises of Commonwealth membership are unacceptable to a new generation of African leaders." Commonwealth Secretary Patricia Scotland, herself of Caribbean origin, spoke with obvious reluctance. "Your Majesty, what President Traoré articulated is consistent with discussions I've been having with other African leaders. The symbolic aspects of Commonwealth membership that seem ceremonial to us represent genuine humiliation to many Africans." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If the Commonwealth could not maintain African membership without abandoning its monarchical character, then it faced an impossible choice: transformation beyond recognition or gradual dissolution. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak addressed the political dimensions. "Your Majesty, losing the Commonwealth would represent a catastrophic blow to Britain's international standing. We would be reduced to a mid-sized European nation with limited global influence, but maintaining it through coercion or manipulation would ultimately be counterproductive," the king replied. President Traoré made it clear that any attempt to pressure African nations would only accelerate their departure. The meeting continued for several hours, but no viable solutions emerged. Every option either required abandoning core features of the Commonwealth or accepting continued African departure. The monarchy's international role was being challenged in ways that traditional diplomacy could not address. 2 weeks after the Buckingham Palace meeting, Traoré delivered a speech at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa that sent shockwaves through Commonwealth capitals. Without mentioning his conversation with King Charles directly, he outlined a vision for post-Commonwealth Africa that rejected all forms of symbolic subordination to former colonial powers. "The time has come," Traoré told the assembled African leaders, "for our continent to complete its decolonization by eliminating the psychological and symbolic remnants of imperial control. We do not need foreign monarchs to validate our sovereignty or ceremonies that celebrate our historical subjugation." The speech was broadcast live across Africa and translated into multiple languages. Its impact was immediate and devastating for Commonwealth cohesion. Within days, several African leaders announced intentions to review their nation's Commonwealth membership. citing Traoré's framework for dignified independence. The king watched these developments from Buckingham Palace with growing recognition that his private meeting with Traoré had failed to achieve its intended purpose. Instead of finding common ground, it had apparently reinforced the young African leader's conviction that the Commonwealth was incompatible with genuine African independence. In his private journal, the king wrote, "My conversation with President Traoré has forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about the Commonwealth. What I had understood as successful post-colonial partnership, he experienced as continued subordination. The institution I hope to preserve as my legacy may be inherently incompatible with the dignity and equality that modern Africa demands." 6 months after the London meeting, the Commonwealth faced its worst crisis since its formation. Nigeria withdrew its membership entirely, followed by Ghana and Kenya. South Africa conducted its promised referendum, voting overwhelmingly to become a republic and leave the Commonwealth. Even traditionally loyal nations like Botswana and Zambia began questioning the value of continued membership. The domino effect that Traoré had set in motion proved unstoppable. Each departure made remaining membership seem increasingly pointless for other African nations. The Commonwealth Games were cancelled due to insufficient participation. Commonwealth trade preferences became meaningless as the most economically significant African members departed. European commentators blamed Traoré for destroying a beneficial institution out of ideological purity. But across Africa, he was celebrated as the leader who had finally articulated what many had felt for decades, that true independence required complete psychological decolonization, including rejection of symbolic subordination to former colonial powers. The king's gamble in seeking direct dialogue with Traoré had backfired spectacularly. Instead of preserving the Commonwealth, it had accelerated its dissolution. The private meeting that was supposed to remain secret became the subject of intense speculation as journalists and diplomats tried to understand how the Commonwealth had collapsed so rapidly. 1 year after their Buckingham Palace encounter, King Charles received an invitation that captured the transformed dynamics of British-African relations. The invitation came not from a Commonwealth capital, but from Ouagadougou, where Traoré was hosting the first Pan-African Independence Conference designed to celebrate complete decolonization and chart Africa's post-Commonwealth future. The king declined the invitation, recognizing that his presence would be seen as an attempt to maintain influence over processes explicitly designed to eliminate British involvement in African affairs. But the symbolic reversal was not lost on royal observers. An African leader was now hosting international conferences that excluded British participation, rather than seeking British approval for African initiatives. As the king reflected on the collapse of the Commonwealth under his watch, he understood that the institution's failure represented more than diplomatic miscalculation. It reflected the fundamental impossibility of maintaining imperial relationships, even symbolic ones, in an era of genuine decolonization. The meeting with Ibrahim Traoré had been intended to save the Commonwealth through compromise and reform. Instead, it had demonstrated that some institutions cannot be reformed because their foundational assumptions are incompatible with the values of the people they claim to serve. For the first time in 750 years, an English king had asked an African leader for help, and that African leader's response, polite, respectful, but absolutely uncompromising, had ended the British monarchy's international role forever.